Hey everyone, this is Bathymetrics, and today we're going to do a bit of a deep dive into oscillator style modulation and also hand-drawn modulation in Bitwig. And as with all my videos in this series, I'm specifically talking about this in the context of how Bitwig does it versus how Ableton does it. And in particular, a kind of oscillation that we all rely on quite a bit in Ableton is the amplitude modulation or frequency modulation inside of Ableton's sampler. So a lot of us will make fairly frequent use of this particular oscillator. And as it turns out, Bitwig's basic default oscillator type modulations, their LFO shapes, don't really match up one-to-one with Ableton's LFO shapes. When you're in Ableton's sampler, the various LFO shapes you have available to you, it's a very small set of a couple different sine waves, some saw waves, some square waves, a triangle wave, and some kind of noise shape, general white noise. And these drive your amplitude modulation against the sample, or a frequency modulation against the sample. And this sine wave is actually very non-linear. It's a different shaped sine wave than normal. So let me demonstrate this kind of in the context of a real-world application of these oscillators. This thing here is a kind of a stacked layered bass rack, and it comprises a few different things. Here's what it sounds like. Okay. What's going on there is we have a sub from a subsequent 37, a sampled subsequent 37, making the sub portion of this bass. We have a white noise layer that is being amplitude modulated with a sine wave oscillator. So it sounds kind of like a little rattlesnake, and it adds some high-end, high-frequency movement and fuzz to the bass patch. And we have a couple glitchy, tweaky, warp laser type sounds that are split across the left and right stereo field and are slightly different from each other. So this is the left one. This is the right one. And both of those are also being modulated with a slightly slower kind of amplitude modulation from a sine wave. Then there's the bass, the basic kind of mid-bass sound in this layer. Pretty boring by itself, as you can see from the oscilloscope up here. But when you put them all together, you have a much more complex and interesting sounding bass. And then, of course, these are all 1/28ths. So this entire sampler full of mid-bass sounds has its own, where are you? It has its own set of different mid-bass samples. They're all being selected with a selector zone index. They're all full keyboard, so this is what we would call a melodic 1/28. They'll play pitches, and there's a little selector knob here in the rack that will switch among the different sounds. So, classic use case for a 1/28, like I talked about in one of my other videos. So the main thing I want to focus on for this video is specifically this white noise layer, because scoping white noise makes it real easy to see the shape of an oscillator and how it's reacting and how it's moving and so on. So again, this is just a simple white noise patch. If I turn off the oscillator entirely, we're just going to see a solid sausage of white noise here. I'm going to turn on the amplitude modulation. And that modulation is being caused by the sine wave shape inside of sampler. And And more importantly, there's like a key tracking on that modulation. It's based on pitch, so the incoming key or note has a certain hertz frequency to it. And this coarse adjustment here is kind of slowing it down to the slowest possible subdivision of that incoming frequency. If I put this coarse value up to 1, this is just basically playing the sine wave at the frequency of the incoming note, which in this case is C2. So it doesn't sound like much. If I slow it down by half, then it sounds like this. And you're starting to hear the graininess of the oscillator. If I slow it down again to 0.25, you hear this. And if I slow it down as far as possible, it sounds like this. And gives us this interesting shape. Now, pay close attention to this shape and notice how it isn't a true sine wave shape. It's not even. The bits that are solid and filled in are where the white noise sound is its loudest. And then the gaps in between is where, it goes down to 0 and there's no sound. And notice that the noisy part is longer and more rounded and kind of slower across the middle, whereas the gaps in the middle are V-shaped and very quick and very sharp. Okay, now that's a very difficult oscillator to make. This is just the way that it's coded in Ableton. It's the way it sounds. And if you were to try to duplicate this in Bitwig with, for example, their classic LFO modulator, you'll get something close, but not quite right. Let's hear what this sounds like real quick. Okay, there's a couple things going on here that make it sound different than the Ableton one. Here's the Ableton one again. I'm going to play it one more time for you. See how that's smooth, has a smooth feeling to it? But by contrast, the Bitwig one is kind of gappy sounding and sharp. So if you're looking at the settings and you kind of understand how this classic LFO works, you might say, well, 50 hertz is probably too slow for that sound. It's a little slower of an oscillation than the other sound. And that's true. The classic LFO, unfortunately, doesn't go any higher than 50 hertz for its speed. And you don't have a lot of control with the classic LFO. This is an old style LFO that they keep around mainly for backward compatibility with older projects done before Bitwig 2 or 2.1 came out, somewhere around there. And I honestly don't recommend this one, although I realize a lot of people will be drawn to it at first because its display, I'm going to slow down the speed a little bit so you can see the display. It has this nice display, kind of like the Max for Live LFO device in Ableton, where you can actually see the waveform. So if you pick different waveforms, you see what the waveform looks like. Different sawtooth ramps, a random LFO, even a kind of smoothed out sample and hold LFO. And so this is very comforting to work with, and you see note values. You can click dotted, triplet, whatever, and you can choose which note value. So this seems very friendly, but in reality, it's pretty limited. It's not very powerful. So I don't actually recommend you get in the habit of using this. Instead, the way that you accomplish really good things in Bitwig, and the way we're going to duplicate the sound of that Ableton LFO, is by using the newer, more modern type of LFO device, which is this one right here. And I'll just bring in a new one. We can ignore this for a second. I'll just bring in a default LFO right here in this box. And this is what it looks like. And you can see it's an LFO shape, but it has this kind of view. It doesn't really show you in a tangible way the scrolling LFO. You have to sort of imagine it in your head. And as we adjust the parameters for this, we can, bring it over to a kind of curved sawtooth in this direction, or a curved sawtooth in that direction. This control here lets us straighten out the curve and make it a true sawtooth if we put this right at 0%. If I put this right in the middle between the two sawtooths, we have a perfect triangle wave. Or here's the sawtooth in the other direction. And then you also have this very interesting thing, which is kind of like, the closest analogy for me is to think of this as like a fold back saturator, wave folding kind of distortion. Because this over here, when I put this on this side, it's a full natural looking LFO shape. And a characteristic of an LFO, if you've never really thought about it, is that when it hits the peak and bottom of the LFO shape, the movement actually slows down a little bit as the line becomes flat for just a second right here and curved near the flat areas. And it's the same thing at the top. It slows down. Whereas right in the middle, you have a solid, straight, sloped line. And so the wave actually moves a teeny bit faster during this middle portion where the straight lines are. So an LFO actually has this uneven kind of momentum or ballistics or inertia to the sound. There's inertia right around the top and bottom of the trough, whereas a triangle wave is very different because there's no inertia, there's no change in speed. As it approaches the bottom or top of the trough, it just instantly turns the corner and keeps going up in a straight linear slope. And so that dot never slows down. It never has a little weighted inertia at the top and bottom. Now, you can also do this, which is this sort of hybrid between a triangle wave and an LFO. And if you pay really close attention to this shape right here, you can see what's happening. It has a fast part near the top and bottom, and there's no slow down or inertia at the top and bottom of the waveform. Instead, it's as it's moving through the middle of the waveform that it will slow down temporarily at this little kind of horizontal curved soft knee that you see here. So this is why I say it's kind of like wave folding. If you think about this, that's one kind of set of ballistics or inertia. And if you flip it all the way over the other way, it's almost like you've wave folded this. And now you have almost two little kind of LFO-ish inertia things happening in one full cycle of the wave. So this may seem a little academic at this point. We'll come back to this and look at this in just a second, but I just kind of wanted to explain to you what you were seeing with this shape here for this LFO. I'm going to go ahead and delete this for now. Come back here and we'll look at this. And before I go any further, I just want to show you the exact settings you would make to duplicate the sound of the Ableton sine wave oscillator inside of the sampler to duplicate it in Bitwig. So here's the Ableton one more time. Go up an octave. So it's key tracking, and it has that interesting kind of ballistic shape to it. Now if we come over to Bitwig and we play this one, oops, let me open up an oscilloscope for you. Here's an octave. Exactly the same shape, exactly the same ballistics, exactly the same kind of inertia. And the way that we achieve that, first I'm going to tell you how to do it. I'm also going to point out that if you're trying to duplicate these settings for yourself later, I'm going to add a section to my Bitwig Handbook. There'll be a link in the comments for the video, but I'll add a section here that just lays out the very specific settings for what you need to do here to duplicate the exact feel and ballistics of that Ableton style sine wave oscillator in Bitwig. So first we start with the LFO. You can ignore this modulator, it's turned off. You can also ignore this key tracking modulator, it's turned off. And I left these in mainly to show you, don't use key tracking when you're doing this particular type of LFO shape. Instead, on the LFO itself, you're going to be using one of the settings that they call pitch, right down here at the bottom. And this is effectively a key tracking LFO without having to set up external key tracking. It's always going to look at the incoming MIDI note and say how many hertz is that frequency. And then it's going to take that frequency and slow it down or speed it up according to this multiplier that you set right here. So again, here's an incoming C2, and I've got it slowed down to 25% when it's making a bipolar shape. If I were to set this to 1, now it's just going to play a C2. The actual frequency of the LFO would be whatever hertz C2 is. Now, in actuality, because I'm using a bipolar shape, it's really half of what C2 is, but I won't go into that math. At any rate, the main thing to remember is you want this oscillator bipolar. You want it to have pitch so that it key tracks its incoming frequency. You want to drop it down to a value of 0.25. So it's key tracking and it's slowed down from the pitch that's coming in. And then this setting right here, you want to be on exactly negative 50%. And you can see that down here if you hover over any button or any knob in anything anywhere. The status bar right about here always tells you what the exact value is. You don't have to actually click on a thing to see what the value is. So as you can see, as I hover here, right down here, it's telling you that its percentage is negative 50%. And that's the LFO part. And then the other trick we're doing is we're using a what I call a additive shaper kind of modulator, something that changes the linear behavior of other things into non-linear behavior. We're using one of their things called polynom to do this. And I guess before I go on, this thing called math, this other modulator type called quantize, another modulator type they call sample and hold, and even kind of sort of, although it's not strictly an oscillator in the same sense as LFO type oscillators are usually thought, this one here called steps. Oops, did I click the wrong one? I did. Try that again. This one called steps is also a kind of nonlinear thing. So there are 1, 2, 3, 4, sample and hold, quantize, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 modulator types that will turn a linear movement into a non-linear movement in various interesting ways. You could also, I guess, consider the randomized modulator to also be a kind of non-linear shaper of the original linear input. So this sounds very gobbledygook and scientific. I'm going to talk about those in more detail later, but the point is this polynom is a very, very useful one for a lot of applications and use cases inside of Bitwig. And so just ignore these that they're on. They're not assigned to anything. Just pretend they don't exist. We're going to focus on these two, the interaction of these two modulators to explain how I'm getting this shape. All right, so it helps to understand how polynom works. And I'm going to do that by adding a new blank polynom right here in this slot. So let's pay attention to this one for a sec. By default, I don't like this default setting, and I changed it back to what it is. You can't really, unfortunately, you can't really save a different default. I wish I could. I have a rack where it brings in this, and it's a different default state that I prefer. but it's easy enough to get to a reasonable, useful default state, which is to make this value 0. So I honestly think Bitwig should have made these the default settings for Polynom, because what's happening here is no change whatsoever between the relationship of the incoming X value and the outgoing Y value. This is a perfectly linear one-to-one relationship. That's the one here, of the incoming signal to the outgoing signal of this particular modulator, right? Having this particular setting would make this modulator have 0 effect on your sound. It would completely match and stay perfectly linear to anything you're sending into it. And the basic idea is you modulate this X knob with something else, like an LFO or a macro knob that you're turning by hand or whatever. And then the idea is you use these other values to make the outgoing Y output of this thing follow a different path than a true linear one-to-one relationship, okay? So the first thing you can do is drag this value around to curve that line. And so if I were to make a really extreme curve like that, now this is no longer linear. As X moves up, the Y moves much more slowly. Like I've moved X from a 0 point in the center to nearly halfway, and yet Y hasn't gone up more than about a quarter of the way up the output axis, right? And as I keep turning it, it's actually going back down again. So this is something that would, like an LFO that would push this all the way to here, is actually seeing very little output movement, and in fact it even turns around and goes backwards a little bit right near the end. Although this downward portion is mostly linear, but a little bit curved, a little bit of a gentle slope, especially right here. And then as you get to the bottom and hit the bottom, it actually maxes out right here. And as I keep going down with the X, the Y doesn't change anymore. So that's what's happening with that little travel right there. If I make this a positive value, things just curve in the other direction in a different way. So here, if I go backwards with the X, the volume goes down, but then it goes up again, right there, and so on. So we're changing what used to be, if I set this back to 0, we're changing what used to be one-to-one linear relationship to something very different and curved looking, right? The other thing that you can do is like a double curve or another sort of fold back. If I crank this value again, and then I crank this value, you see we get a second curve in there. And it's easiest to see if I do something like, set this to 0. Let's set all these to 0 so it's a flat line again. Okay, so here there's no change at all. X comes in, I'm at any value, and it just sends one unchanging value out of this modulator. Now, if I take and curve it, I can make something that looks an awful lot like an LFO shape now, because it's evenly curving around that center point. So if I go to something like that, and then this thing here just raises the center of the X in a way. So I could make something that looks a lot like an LFO by doing something like this. And then what this is doing is warping, putting in another set of curves in the middle of that LFO shape. If I make this flatter again, and here, let's do this. Let's bring it all down to 0 one more time, just to make it really clear what's going on. If I only change this one, it does this kind of folding on the ends. The middle stays flat, these curve, and if I were to start, putting a different curve in here, like an LFO style curve, then we start getting some odd shapes like this, right? And then if I change the slope, it does more things. So the point is you can get almost any kind of nonlinear curve out of this without having to understand the math behind it. And that's what's going on with polynom. So we'll ignore this one now, and we'll go back to this one. So the main thing I've done here is I set a kind of sine wave shape by putting this to exactly -1, this particular third value here. These two values stay 0, and so that made this curvy sine wave shape. And then I pushed the whole thing up. Instead of being here, starting at 0, I basically turned up the volume on the sine wave to 0.50. Just make it exactly 0.50 for this. And then I made this LFO modulate the x value of the polynom by exactly a ratio of 1 to 1. So I'm basically saying use the full range, take it from 0 and push it all the way to max as this LFO shape is moving around from max to minimum. Okay, that's all that's going on here. And so the resulting shape is that if I slow this down a lot, let me slow down this oscillator by going to hertz instead of pitch. And now you can see it moving and what's actually happening here. This is actually like a clean, smooth LFO shape, but it slows down at the curve and it speeds up as it approaches the bottom and quickly bounces back and forth through the bottom points, but it slows for this part here. Okay, so as it approaches these pointy min and max values, it maintains its speed, but as it hits the center, it slows down a lot. See how it just gets this real inertia right through the center there? So that's what's happening. And if we were to play this wave at this very slow speed, that's what it looks like. And as we speed it up, and so this sort of triangular pointy gap between the fatter, slower portion of the LFO is being caused by this bouncy point at the min and max values. And then the reason it makes such a nice, smooth, rounded, wide section of noise in the middle is because it's slowing down for this part here. So there's no other way to get this ballistic behavior, this kind of shape. You can't get this kind of shape with the LFO alone. You have to make the LFO behave in a non-linear manner using this specific combination. And again, most importantly, you want to set it to pitch, and you want to set the ratio of that pitch to 0.25, and we end up with this. Which sounds exactly like the Ableton one. Okay, so if you don't want to understand anything else except how to make Bitwig's LFO shape in a sampler sound exactly like the Ableton LFO shape in a sampler, this is how you do it. These two settings right here. Your LFO is assigned to the full range of input on the polynom, and that's all it's assigned to. And then your polynom is the thing that's actually assigned over here to the amplitude or gain of the sampler itself. So this is the start point, and I'm pushing it up by this amount in terms of the gain. And then you can also control the depth of the sine wave with this depth control on the LFO. So here's what that looks like. See, now there's not much difference between the basic white noise and the amount of volume above white noise that the LFO is pushing it, but as I keep pushing this up, the difference becomes more clear and more pronounced. right? And I like it at about, I felt like right around 80% is where it had the same ballistic feel and gappiness as the Ableton LFO. So again, I will put these specific values in the Bitwig guide you can refer to later and set this up. But now I want to show you the other thing that I think a lot of people ask about. And then I'm going to go into more esoteric things like how to use all these other nonlinear modulator types. But here's another really useful trick. I've seen questions like this come up a lot. And the question is, how do I do like a Serum style hand-drawn modulation envelope? Okay, we all love Serum. Let's just pop Serum open on a new track real quick. Oops, that's FX. I don't want FX. Go away. I wish they named them different. Okay, we want Serum. So everyone loves, oh, and of course I got rid of the wrong one. My bad. One more time. So everyone loves Serum because you can make these hand-drawn LFOs with any kind of shape you want, right? You can add new LFO points, create any kind of crazy complex LFO shape you want to have. Oh, stop that. Really? Okay. Oh, I got to put a new point in here, don't I? As you can tell, I don't draw my own shapes in Serum that much. So you can make these crazy LFO shapes, and people are like, how can I do that in Bitwig? How can I do that on any kind of sound, like a sampler wave? So it's actually super easy in Bitwig. And unfortunately, it requires something that isn't native to Bitwig. I'm willing to bet sooner or later they add their own version of a Serum-style LFO drawing thing. But you don't need that if you have LFO Tool, which is also made by the same people who make Serum. So just as an example, this is what LFO Tool looks like, and it's the same kind of grid that you can draw any kind of shape you want on. As many points as you want, whatever granularity you want, and you can set the rate of it. You can lock it to the tempo of your DAW. So this is free running. This isn't requiring any kind of MIDI note input. It's just taking whatever signal I pass through it. And let's slow this down a little bit too. So, it goes from 0 volume, very high, curves down slowly to here, goes up high, curves all the way to the bottom, up high, all the way to the bottom again, and then starts that cycle over. And this is happening at a rate of 1/4 note based on a tempo of 140, okay? And then what's driving this signal, what's actually creating the signal running through it, you don't need to make a MIDI clip. You don't need to do any of that because Bitwig has this wonderful audio device they call test tone. Now, I'm not going to play the test tone for you because it'll blow your ears out. It's pretty loud to make sure that this shape is nice and bold. But the basic idea is you pick a frequency. It's just a constant sine wave test tone. Right now it's running a sine frequency of about 2.36 kilohertz. I have the gain up pretty high. I have the mix all the way up, but it's just putting out a constant sine wave tone that's feeding through LFO Tool. And LFO Tool is jerking the volume around on that sine wave according to the shape that we've drawn here. So we have a modulator of a sine wave that looks like this. A 1/4 second, I'm sorry, a 1/4 beat tempo against a 140 BPM project speed, okay? So I'll leave this open so you can see it, and then we'll come down here to this same one. We're going to disable these 2 modulators, just deactivate them. And this modulator here is called audio rate. We're going to activate audio rate. And as soon as I activate it, you can see that it has a shape running through it that looks suspiciously similar to this hand-drawn shape right here. If I modify some of these things, see, I'm taking this one way down, this shape changes accordingly, and so on. Let's explain what's going on. In Bitwig, there are 3 different kinds of sidechain oriented modulators. Some of them you know very well. One of them is called audio sidechain, and it looks and acts exactly like a typical compressor sidechain with attack and release settings, a filter range you can set up to determine what part of the incoming signal you're listening to, and it can take input from any track or anything anywhere inside your project, like literally anything that generates sound you can specify as the input to this sidechain, and then you can take the output of this sidechain and use it to control other things, right? That's effectively what's happening here, is it's setting up the sidechain. Now, this is a modulator that I could assign to anything like volume, envelope, filter, whatever, and make it bounce around to match any signal that pushes over, any signal that pushes up in the frequency range that I've selected with the filters. So if something pops right here, that's going to trigger the sidechain, and it's going to make the modulator like bounce some other knob up and down by that amount. So you're all familiar with this. This is how we do bass and kick sidechaining, sub and kick sidechaining, and so on. There's another type of sidechain-like device that they call an envelope follower. And that one is kind of like a sidechain, except it doesn't have the filters on it. So it's the whole signal, all the way from 20 hertz all the way up through 22 kilohertz. And the only kind of control you have over it is the attack and release time, and whether it's kind of averaging the signal according to peak or RMS. And both a sidechain modulator and an envelope follower are what we would call an averaged sidechain. It's an averaging kind of sidechain. It's not directly following and mimicking exactly the original input signal. Instead, it's reacting slowly or quickly with attack settings. It's fading out slowly or quickly to match the original signal with the release settings. It's going to have different kind of reaction ballistics to it, depending on whether you're following the peak or RMS, and so on and so forth. So these are what they call average sidechain things. But the third type of sidechain device we have in Bitwig is called audio rate. And what makes audio rate special, as I open it up here, is that you feed some device input into it, and it's completely instantaneous. It's not averaged at all. It will create an envelope that exactly follows the original signal. So that's what's going on over here. This is an audio rate modulator, and as its source, we're giving it on this mod source track, we're basically saying, give me everything right here, pre-fader, but post all the other devices that are in that track's chain. Back here, we're saying my mod source, the source for this audio rate is going to be this track called mod source, and we're going to take the pre-signal, pre-fader signal from this track called mod source. So that's why, because it's set up that way, you're seeing an envelope here that pretty much exactly matches whatever LFO tool is doing to that sine wave. And I mean, in real time, as I change things, you're going to see those shapes change, right? And so the trick now is you have this audio rate. It's picking up this shape from some constant tone in some different place. And then you can assign this as a modulator to something like the gain knob, right? And then if I were to play this, it should sound kind of like this. Now you'll notice it hasn't I feel like I've got something extra going on here. That's still throwing things off. These are off. This should be... All right, I have got something a little bit out of sync here, but I'll show you the next part that I know is working correctly. There's an easier way to do this if you want to do hand-drawn modulation. Oh, that's what's wrong. I was listening to this track, not this one. Let's go here. And let's try that one more time. So we'll go back to you, open you up. You open. That's better. My bad. Sorry about that. Okay. Okay, see how it's just following whatever envelope shape I'm making here in real time? Okay, but there's a more elegant way to do this that doesn't require you to have a dedicated track with some sort of modulation signal on it. Oh, and I guess before I leave here, I could show you one other thing. How about we use a different modulation source like Gatekeeper by Infected Mushroom and Polyverse. So this is a trance gating plugin. This is a very fast kind of gate pattern, and this is what this would sound like because this is now the signal that's running through the mod source track, and you can see this shape's changed quite a bit, and it sounds like this. Okay, which is exactly the shape here. So pretty much anything you can do that gates or modifies the volume on a simple test tone on some source that's muted will create a really wonderful way to do hand-drawn automation of anything. So let's show you the more elegant way to do this, which is this track. And here we've set up the same kind of thing, just in a different way. This is an instrument layer container. It has a white noise sampler on it. And then I've got two other chains or layers or channels, as Bitwig calls them. One of them is an LFO tool layer, and you'll see that each layer has its own test tone generator, right? This layer here has a test tone followed by LFO tool. This layer here has test tone followed by Gatekeeper. Both of them are muted, so no sound is actually coming out of them and being sent to our master track. But the white noise has two different audio rate mods on it. One of the audio rate mods is taking its input from this LFO tool chain inside of this same track. And then this audio rate mod here is taking the input from Gatekeeper from this chain right here. So the point is you could have like 3 or 4 different LFO tool chains, each with a slightly different shape on them. And you could do automation or various tricks to like switch which one is actually modifying your sample at any given point up in the main track. So again, this is what this sounds like. And so on. And then if we want to switch to the Gatekeeper module, we just basically deactivate this one. And instead, we activate this one. And now it's going to play whatever's on the Gatekeeper track, which is this shape right here. And again, it's just modifying the amplitude of the gain in the sampler. Okay, so that's how you do hand-drawn automation is LFO tool, draw any shape you want, have as many as you want, figure out how to set them up inside of a single rack in an instrument layer, or this could be an instrument selector and I could use some automation to jump between which one of these was actually active, which LFO shape was active, and there's just tons of things you could do. Or you could just layer and have 3 different LFO tool shapes, all automating the same knobs or different knobs inside the sampler, just like you would in Serum, where you could assign multiple LFOs to the same kind of thing, and get some interesting interaction between the LFOs. So what I've showed you so far is how to duplicate an Ableton style sine wave from the sampler using these 2 things in a very specific way. I've shown you the how to do hand-drawn automation using LFO tool and a test tone and the audio rate modulator. And now, if you want to stay with me just a little longer, I will explain some other tricks that are useful, other ways to approach the way you do oscillator type modulation in Bitwig. Let's go back for a second to the classic LFO mod. Again, this is attractive if you're new and you don't really understand how to think about setting up crazy modulator shapes yourself. It's attractive because you just pick from a list of common, typical oscillator types. The problem is your speed doesn't have a lot of control. Your note values don't have a lot of control. It's just very clunky in ways. I mean, if it works for you, it works great. If all you want is a simple sine wave and you don't need it to be too fast, then sure, go ahead and use it. And if you want to make it easy to make it beat synced to a quarter note or an eighth note or a triplet 16th or whatever, sure, go ahead and use it. But I encourage you to not work with this and instead do what I'm about to show you, because you'll get a lot more mileage out of the newer LFOs that duplicate all this functionality. So let's explain what's going on here. Sine wave, as you saw, we can duplicate that with the standard new LFO shape. And you get a sine wave by just making sure this knob is all the way over to the right. And now you have a perfect sine wave. And you have a lot more options for speed. Like this tops out at 50 hertz, whereas this sine wave, you can crank it up to 50, right? But then you can also go into kilohertz and start going into 50 kilohertz, right? Huge. This is musical tones now. This is like, push a DC offset device and you've actually got an oscillator, a musical oscillator coming out of this one LFO. You can also set it up to oscillate according to note subdivisions of your project tempo up here, and then pitch we talked about earlier, where it'll just take whatever the incoming MIDI note is, and depending on this value, it's like, well, are you taking the exact hertz of that MIDI note, or half of that value, or a quarter of that value, or twice that value? And you can basically make it key follow just by picking pitch, and then just speed it up or slow it down on whatever root note you want to build some riff on, and then it'll just automatically key follow from that point. So that's what pitch is. And then hold, honestly, I don't use that so much. I think it just makes it a constant shit. I'm not going to say what it does, because I haven't looked into this too much, because I've never needed to look at something like that. Read the manual or experiment. So back to, let's pick a slower, more reasonable rate that we can see here. So here's the speed at about 60.65 hertz. Again, you can make it a sawtooth, kind of. An interesting hybrid sawtooth where there's a curve on one side of it by doing this. So that's something you can't get out of here. There's no hybrid sine and sawtooth in this. There's triangle, 2 types of sawtooth. So back here on the new LFO, if you want a pure triangle, you put this right in the middle, this one knob, and now it's a perfect triangle. If you want to turn it into a up-ramping sawtooth, you do that. And a down-ramping sawtooth, you do that with this set at triangle. But again, you can get that hybrid kind of sawtooth shape this way. And then, of course, there's that interesting wave folding kind of shape that I showed you, which again can be bent with the sawtooth into some interesting behavior. Like, look how fast it drops, and then it takes a very slow rise with a really slow point in the middle, or how slow it drops and how fast it rises, right? So you can get some interesting shapes just with the interaction of these two buttons. There's also a full delay for, like, if this is targeted from a MIDI on note, there will be a delay before the LFO kicks on. And then this is a fade in. It's not a delay. It's like, well, it's working from the beginning, but you don't hear it or feel it until it hits a certain number of milliseconds, or even, 4-second delay, 8-second delay. I mean, it's crazy. So you can get a lot of really interesting mileage out of the LFO itself just through these things. This is how the amplitude of the whole thing, like how much it affects your outgoing sound. This makes it bipolar or unipolar, so only positive values or positive and negative values. You can set it to sync to be free running, or synced against incoming MIDI notes, or synced against your project tempo, or a random sync, which means it's just always different every time you hit a MIDI note. It'll start at different points of the cycle. You can make it polyphonic. And now let's set it back to look more like a sine wave. If I play one note, oh, damn it. Let's do it on this controller instead. If I play one note, let's see, I'm going to have to turn the chord on. Wait, where am I? I'm on this one. Sorry about that. Let's also hear it. So you can see one note's coming through and going up as I play a key. Let's slow it down. I feel like I'm not playing the right thing. That's the right one. Oh, it's because this isn't actually assigned to be the modulator. Let's deactivate this one. Let's deactivate we'll leave key tracking on. So this one we're going to assign to the amplitude, just a little bit of gain increase. So now if I play a key, nothing's happening because my LFO speed's incredibly nothing. Speed it up. Let's slow it down so we can watch it for this part. So one note coming through. Now I'm going to play two notes at the same time. Well, one after the other. I need to make my sampler polyphonic too, because this was set up mono originally. There we go. Okay, now it'll take two notes. See how they chase each other? Here's three notes. And they're each starting, at the top left when you first trigger on the note. If I try and play them at exactly the same time, they'll be closer together. And so on. So the point is, this can be polyphonic. This one is a little bit different. The per voice is kind of sort of polyphonic, but it's not polyphonic in the same way. I mean, it is, but it isn't, because you can get into some interesting things with the modulators coming out of I'm not going to go there. Never mind. Just understand that this makes it polyphonic, and you can see the behavior of multiple notes on the waveform. Okay, so key tracking. Key tracking is not necessarily that useful with an LFO if you're going to base it on pitch. But if for some reason you want to base it on some other value of speed, like a quarter note or a dotted quarter note against a 140 tempo, well, then you don't have key tracking anymore. If you pick anything other than pitch, or if you pick plain old free running hertz or kilohertz or whatever, there's no key tracking happening as you press different incoming notes. So for that, you would want to make sure you're using the key tracking mod. And the nice thing about the key tracking mod is unless you're trying to do something fancy, you can always just bring it in by itself, and the default values for it are perfectly set up to do the math that's needed to exactly match the notes and semitones of a keyboard. And by default, it's centered on C3 or MIDI note 60. If I play a C2, here's the one that's actually active. If I play a C2, you can see it shows C2 here. If I play an F2, it's going to move up a little bit here to F2. If I play C3, it'll be right on the center. If I play C4, it'll be up here. B flat 4, A, so on. So the point is, if you want to use any kind of different speed value for your LFO and you want it to react with key tracking, you're going to need to add a key track oscillator and just leave it at the defaults, and then take its modulation assignment thing and attach it to the LFO itself at a rate of exactly 1. So right there. So again, this modulator is adjusting whatever the starting value of the LFO is, the LFO rate, by a value of exactly 1. And it's worth clicking this and double checking up here and making sure that it's exactly 1. I already had it set before, so we'll get rid of this one. But if this is any value other than 1, just double click it and make it 1, so that the ratio of multiplication and division as you move up and down the keyboard is affecting this frequency knob by exactly the right multiplier to mimic key tracking behavior. Okay. So then if that's set correctly, we should be able to see it right here. You'll see a little blue dash if I move up to a really high octave. Okay, it may not be set up correctly, so let's just double check. Okay, it's not on there. I got rid of the wrong one. I've got so many things going on in this particular patch now, so let's just take this one more time and assign it. Go up here to 1, just any positive value, double click, make it 1. And now we've got key tracking, so there's C2, and there's C4, C5. And you can see how it's speeding up by exactly the frequency needed for key tracking. If I speed this up, you'll almost be able to hear it musically in the white noise. There's C3, C4, C3. See, it's almost musical at that speed. So that's how you can do key tracking against an LFO when you're using something other than pitch. This will confuse the hell out of you for a while, but trust me, you'll get the hang of it eventually. If you're going to use pitch, then you probably don't want to also add key tracking on top of the key tracking that the pitch itself is already doing. So just bear that in mind, as there's 2 ways to do it, and it really depends on your value here. So that's a basic LFO. Let's talk a little bit now about, so we talked about basic sine wave, a triangle wave, how to get these 2 sawtooth waves. What we haven't talked about yet is how to get a square wave. Okay, so in a classic LFO, a square wave is going to look like this. Let's activate this, slow it down, let's deactivate, deactivate. Okay, slow it down a little bit. Okay, there's a square wave. Very basic, very simple. So how do we get this on some way other than with the classic LFO. So again, here's a classic LFO with a square wave. It sounds like this. I'm in a new track now. Turn all this off. So that's a square wave. Let's speed it up. Okay, but if you want to do it without a classic LFO, how would you do that? The answer, so we deactivate this, is we use the steps mod and we make it have only 2 steps. So again, the way steps works, it's over here, it's called steps. By default, it's going to come in with 16 steps turned on. And the basic idea behind steps mod is, it could be following your play transport. It could be bass, it could be restarting its sequence every time a new note triggers, or it could just be randomly starting anywhere in the middle of the sequence and then follow that sequence for as long as the note is held down. Or it can work in a cool way, kind of like counter, or there's a really cool M4Live modulator called Count, I think. Count. I can't remember what it was called, but it was really hard to get because the person who made it stopped having it up and you had to kind of have a friend who had it to get it. But Count is really useful. And Bitwig has a counter modulator that's exactly the same, but you can also get the same behavior as counter, which is basically just saying every time a new note plays, advance the playhead to the next step in this pattern. And then each step can have a different type of modulation on it, right? So there's a lot of different ways you can set this up. But the basic idea is you say, okay, well, step 1's going to have a positive value. Step 2 will have a negative value. Step 3, maybe a tiny positive value. Step 4, huge, negative value. And you can just sit here and draw shapes, whatever, right? And as it advances through here, by whatever method you have here, it's going to have a positive or negative modulation amount. And then, of course, you would assign that to some knob. Like over here, I could assign it to a filter and have it just jump in this filter cutoff all around. That's one way you would use steps. Probably a typical way you use steps. But let's get rid of steps. Let's get rid of it. And what we're using here to accomplish the same thing as a square wave oscillator is steps with only 2 steps in it, free running at a certain hertz or whatever value you want it to have. You'll notice it's got all those nice values, kilohertz, pitch for key tracking, all that stuff. You can change the phase, you can smooth it out and so on. Like right now, this is going to sound exactly like the other one. So this is the one that's active now. I thought it was active. I haven't assigned it, so let's go assign it. Let's turn that down a little bit, that assignment. Okay. Same exact as this one. And if I want to speed it up, slow it down. Okay, so there's your square wave, if you want to see it in an oscilloscope. Okay, perfect square wave. Here's how you set the amount of it, and so on, the modulation depth. So that's a square wave modulation. Let's look at a random modulation. Again, here's the classic LFO with the random curve selected. This is kind of what it looks like. It's just randomly picking. In this case, I'm unipolar, so I'm staying above 0, and it's just various positive values. So that sounds like this, and looks like this. Wait. Wrong one. Random LFO. Okay, so here's the classic LFO, different values, loud, quiet. This is what it looks like in Smexoscope. Let's speed it up. Okay, so you can see that it's very sharp. It's very quantized looking. Just bumping up and down in these very sharp quantized random values, and there's no smoothing really on it. You could play with this thing to smooth it a little bit, but it is what it is. So if you wanted to do this without using the classic modulator, you would use the random modulator instead. And when you bring it in by default, it's going to look kind of like this. Oh, now this is in polyphonic mode. This will confuse you a while too. If you bring something in and you don't see a little line indicating your wave, look very closely at the bottom here and turn off poly if it's on. So now we see the random wave itself flipping through just like the classic oscillator did. Now let me explain what's going on with poly. I'll sidetrack for a second. If you've got a lot of oscillators that might normally display a line for a monophonic signal, poly will instead show a bunch of dots that'll bounce up and down at different rates, like if I do this. Oh, again, my sampler itself isn't set to polyphonic, so let's make it polyphonic. All right, now you're going to see 3 dots bouncing up and down here. Move my cursor out of the way for you. 2 dots, 3 dots, 4 dots. I'm holding down 4 notes. And so you get this little visual indicator of the randomization happening, right, when it's polyphonic. But in this case, let's go back to a quantized monophonic mode. And am I looking at the right Smexoscope? Probably not. Let's make sure I'm looking at this one. Okay, there we go. Oh, I haven't assigned the modulator. Let's go over here and make it bounce the amplitude up and down. There we go. Let's speed it up. So again, it's very quantized looking, right? That's the way random pretty much works. You could smooth this out in a variety of ways, but by default, random's always going to be a little digital and quantized looking like this. Now, these other controls give you a little more fine control over the actual randomization shape. This is kind of max. This is smoothing it out to be a little more linear looking. So now it looks a little more sine wavy, but random. And you can make it as smooth as possible or kind of halfway in between smooth and quantized or very quantized, right? So that's what this does. Very powerful. You can't do that in the classic LFO easily. Then this one here is kind of like how far apart are the randomized steps? How much will they jump around from one step to the next? So here, the steps will stay closer together to each other as they move up and down. They're not going to jump quite so far. If I push this all the way up, see how this line only slowly moves up and down and you hardly get any kind of randomization going on. But as I pull it back this way, you're going to start having bigger possible jumps. And if I move it all the way over here, it's usually if you go all the way here, you get a kind of feedback loop where it just stays exactly the same. But as long as you're like not at 100% on either side, right about here is where you typically get your biggest jumps. And then as you get closer to the end, it starts sticking together again, but in different ways. This is like sticking together, but big jumps. This is more up and down. This is closer together, but very little jumps. And again, a lot depends on what's going on here too. There's a little bit of interaction between the two. Okay, so you just play with these two things. Here's the amplitude. Again, you can trigger it in several ways. Again, you don't have pitch because pitch isn't really necessary for random. It's just more like basic free running or beat divisions. And that's random modulation. And then finally, let's do sample and hold. If you're not familiar with what sample and hold is, it's kind of this diagram I thought did a good job of explaining it. Sample and hold basically looks at a linear or curved wave, and it says, okay, I'm going to hold whatever value I find at the start of each beat, like a 16th note or an 8th note or a quarter note or whatever, and whatever value the waveform is sitting at when I hit that beat marker or that grid marker, I'm just going to hold that exact same value until the next beat. And then if it's changed, I'll hold that value for a while. And then at the next beat, I'll check what it is and I'll hold that for a while and so on. So it's basically a way to quantize or make granular a curved or linear kind of analog signal. It's kind of like bit crushing in a way. So that's effectively what sample and hold is, and you can have it very sharp like this or kind of smoothed out with more like diagonal crossings as it changes. But Bitwig has several different ways of doing sample and hold. One of them is in the classic LFO. It's this shape down here, and this is a very highly smoothed sample and hold, so it's going to be more rounded looking. So again, this is what it sounds like. Let's see, let's solo that one. Let's make sure I'm on that track. Let's make sure I'm looking at the right oscilloscope. Okay, there we go. Let's speed it up a little bit. So as you can see, sample and hold kind of looks random. It almost looks like the random did. But all it's really doing is it's saying, well, at this speed, you know, what would a normal LFO look like at that point in the normal 7.73 kilohertz cycle? And then I'm just going to hold that until the next whatever. And it's kind of random. And it's always smooth. It's always this rounded, smooth thing. Now, the way you would do this without the classic LFO, and again, we'll disable the classic LFO, and we'll come use the sample and hold modulator itself. Now, before I forget again, we'll assign it to the amplitude. About that much should be okay. And now, if we play this, it's just white noise right now because I haven't made anything change. The basic idea with sample and hold is you put something on the input and then it looks at the signal that you send to the input and it does its granularity or smoothing or whatever. So what we're going to do here is we're going to go back to the classic LFO and I'll enable it again. I will, however, unhook it from the gain. That one. Okay. And then I'm going to take this LFO and what have I done? What have I done? Let's just get rid of that entirely. Okay, there's our sample and hold. Nothing's happening to it. Let's put a new LFO on here. We'll just put the standard LFO on it. And I will take the LFO and assign it to the input of sample and hold. Like, let's just go halfway. And so right now the sample and hold is, you can see that as the input comes in and moves the sample and hold input, actually, let's make this even stronger. Make it really big so it's obvious what's happening. So the LFO is modulating the sample and hold with positive and negative values. The sample and hold is what's actually modulating the gain knob on the sampler. And if you look really closely here, you'll see that it's jumping in this granular quantized way to different values each time, both positive and negative. And it's matching this line here because it's taking the input LFO and it's turning it into this shape at each point of the current sample rate. Like let's do a 16th note. Let's make it slower. Let's do a quarter note of our project tempo of 140. So this is every quarter note. It's saying where is the travel of the LFO? And let me just hold that for a quarter note. Let's make it even slower. That's a dotted quarter note. Let's pick a half note. Okay. So every half note, it's just saying where is the sine wave, and let me hold that value for a while. So the result, turn this down. Looks like this. And then if I want to speed it up, of course, I could go to a faster value. And see how it's still doing a sine wave, but the sine wave itself is gritty and grainy looking. And if I speed up the sine wave, if I make it unipolar, zoom in a little bit on the time, you can see how it's taking what is normally a sine wave and it's just making it grainy as heck, right? To match. And you can see this also changed to unipolar when I made the sine wave unipolar. So again, you can use sample and hold to take any incoming shape and do this kind of weird sample and hold quantizing to it. And then there's a smoothing parameter that'll make it less gritty and grainy. And start making it look a little more like that other thing we saw incoming from the classic LFO. But there's still some gappiness in there, and that's largely because I've got this running in bipolar mode. See? So the point I'm trying to make here is, here's what I'm trying to make is that the one thing that I feel is kind of sort of useful still about the classic LFO is if you're looking for this one specific, stop that. If you're looking for this one specific kind of randomized shape, let's take all these off. This one sample and hold shape, I haven't found yet. Maybe it's there and I just haven't seen it. But I feel like this kind of interesting sample and hold waveform can't be achieved any other way easily that's obvious to me, or I'd be showing it to you right now. This is a very unique waveform. And you're kind of only going to get it out of this sample and hold. And you'll just have to play with it and find your own way there with sample and hold. I honestly don't use sample and hold that much in any of my music. So I haven't really beat my head on this one yet. But at any rate, that's my long tour of the basic oscillator style options you have. The last thing we could talk about are these nonlinear modifiers. We already talked about polynom to death, so I won't go into that anymore, but I will point out that there's a few others. So this is just a slow running LFO. If I were to add a math modifier, this is another kind of nonlinear change to shape. The way it basically says is whatever comes in on signal A, you're going to multiply it by a certain percentage set by this second knob. That's all this is doing. So if we were to send this LFO into here and make it push this knob up like this much, and then we multiply it by this amount, it's just going to make the swings of the LFO much bigger. And you have some other options. You can add the result of A and B. You can subtract B from A. You can do this interesting min and max where it basically says, and this is interesting, so let's actually do this one. I'm going to assign this oscillator to the incoming A, and we'll bring it down to 0. So the sine wave right now, and let's speed it up just a teeny bit. The sine wave is coming into this, and we have it set to max, which basically says whichever one is bigger, A or B, that's what I want you to send on to the thing that's being modulated. So let's clear all the modulation from this guy. Off. So the LFO is going there. We don't have any modulation happening here now. So we're going to modulate this. And so what you'll see here is this value is never changing because B right now is always bigger than A, even though A is being modulated. But if I move this down just enough, actually, let's just increase the modulation here. I'm going to put it past the point of B, and as soon as I move it a little bit past B, you can see that every time this value pushes past where B is set, you'll finally see a tiny little bump right here. Okay, so that's what max is useful for, and you can use negative max, positive max, and there's some good tricks with max. And then this is another version of quantize. If you you can say how much you want it to be quantized, and it'll jump around to different values of quantizing this original A input. If you look closely, you'll see there's a little graininess to that. Let's see, can I make the graininess more obvious? Well, use the quantize plugin for this, the quantize modulator. But that's kind of what math does. Especially min and max can be useful in certain situations. Let's take that one off gain. And let's take a look at math. Quantize, we talked about. I think we've covered it. I think we've covered all the stuff I want to cover. All right. Thank you very much for hanging with me. Hopefully this has given you some ideas about how to make the shapes you want in Bitwig for any kind of oscillator. Most of your bread and butter is going to be with the polynom or the math operator operating against a sine wave to get shapes you can't get out of the various classic LFO or more modern LFO. And there's also the beat LFO, which I'm not going to go into. It's just a very single-use specific LFO that you can set up to, basically its tempo is always based on beat. The main advantage of the beat LFO, it looks a lot like the other regular LFO, but the main advantage is you can set it, it's always set by some version of a beat division for its speed. And then most importantly, you can set it to be modified by the global groove pool, which is this guy right here. And these settings here for the, well, if we enable the groove, these settings right here for shuffle and accent, whatever. This is pretty useful if you want to make sure your LFO can have some swing or shuffle or groove to it and have your LFO kind of change in response to maybe automation you're doing on your groove pool for some reason, or just have an LFO that isn't a straight feel but is more of a swung feel. So it's basically the same as the other LFO. Just remember that you can assign it to be modulated by the groove pool in a positive or negative way. So this is worth experimenting with when you have time. But to really explain this, I would have to go into a lot of detail about the groove pool, and that's not necessary. This is pretty straightforward, and you can explore it on your own. So again, thank you for hanging with me. Hopefully this has been useful. And as always, if you found this useful, do me a solid and throw me a follow on either my SoundCloud or my Spotify. That would be very wonderful. And I'll see you later. Bye-bye.